Hello and welcome to Vulgar Complexity, a subsidiary of Varn blog, which is weird. Today we're talking about the complexity of intersectionality, which is a continuation of what we began on complexity theory and labor. And we had some talk about intersectional theory, and I'll just mention the email. You mentioned Peggy
Macintosh, I believe.
Macintosh, yeah, which I learned in all the way back when I was an educator, because that's where that comes out of, is critical pedagogy. And the invisible knapsack essay, which I've even taught the high schoolers. The invisible knapsack essay, how do I say this politely, is stupid. And one of the reasons why is she reduces every factor that she says is a limiting factor to race. And then I immediately point out that, like, even white working class people don't have access to some of those and not others, but she's attributing all the race because her view of race is literally actually weirdly unintersectional, as in, like, she does not consider class, ethnicity, section, region, or any of that when she's talking about race at all. It is a binary.
Yeah. I mean, that's a good point. What you say is that it's not an intersectional approach, right? It's a kind of racial essential approach to race.
Yes, and that's and one that you can't talk about this without getting into critical legal theory and CRT, or critical race theory. I like to start off with a history of this from a different angle, which is I always do this to disarm Marxists who want to come at me about how intersectionality is a bourgeois deviation, because the people who came up with standpoint epistemology, something that I personally actually completely and utterly reject, were combining liberal theories with explicit Marxist theories. So Harding and Donna Haraway and those people were coming out of a Marxist feminist collective, and they dug up some parts of Lukács's History and Class Consciousness and tried to abstract from that a kind of systemic epistemology theory. And I've always said the problem with standpoint epistemology is its simple form is absolutely true, and its complex form is other bullshit. So the simple form is like, you, of course, are limited by your sociological status in any given system, and that both informs and limits your knowledge, and also gives people, like, other people don't have certain knowledges of, particularly of qualia of experience that you do, whereas they might have structural knowledge or whatever. That's, to me, perfectly defensible. That's not a radical, like that.
I mean, it's kind of a basic, it's a basic phenomenology. It's a basic insight of experience, right?
Right.
Like, and I think that and I think that it's broader than just kind of, obviously I think that people have, I mean, you can get so crazy with this that you have to have a totally separate and unique political perspective for every single person, and you have to, that it kind of, you can go to a point of absurdity. But I think there are kind of, at a larger scale, experiences that that are racially classifiable, right? Like, so it is, and that might help people build particular ways of knowing and particular skills, and that is contextual broadly. But I think that you can make some large scale claims about that. But, like,
Right.
But so standpoint, yeah, obviously, like,
So I will say this: simple standpoint epistemology is true.
Yeah.
The idea, however, that you know your position better than anyone else because of your identity category, I think that's bullshit. Like, for what I mean is, like, yes, there are certain things you'll know, certain elements about your position you know because of your stance in the racial category, but there's also things that are closed off to you because of your particular stance.
Absolutely.
category, including sometimes the structure of racism itself.
No, absolutely. I mean, that's what's so. I mean, one of the things I've always thought about. One of the things I've said for many years is that, like, the most racist thing that most people do is hire people they know, right? And like, and I got that insight through working in largely white institutions, right? And seeing that it's like people aren't explicitly doing racism. They're
They're
just doing
explicitly doing nepotism, which is
what,
structurally
but it's not
racist.
even nepotism. It's sociality. It's basic sociality. It's like how many people are one skip away, one hop away in their immediate social network, right? And in a segregated society, those people are going to majority be their, come from their race and class background, right? And so it's like you prepare. I mean, it's just basically I said this before I got into kind of the more theoretical end, but like it's just that it's social reproduction, right? Like,
so my realization of structural racism is actually similar, and it came out of a job. I worked for a Morehouse graduate, black guy from historically black college in a big corporation, and I noticed as an accounts receivable person who I was calling all day and looked at the actuarial charts and pointed out that, like, these are based off of aggregate information, some of which has to do with policing and some of which has to do with home prices, which, by 2007 this was a lot more obvious to people. But that you're not a bigot, I don't think I'm a bigot, and yet we're perpetuating a bigoted system that nobody is in charge of. And in fact, nobody even set this up. Like, what we're doing is in charge of maintaining a bigoted system. It's that our data points are from certain things that have historical markers that we cannot include in our data points and mitigate for because of other, systemic analysis. I also think business in particular has a present bias, but so we're not factoring that into pricing, and so we're actually compounding the problem by charging certain people more money. And yes, it also compounds poverty. It's not just race, but I noticed it was very, very, like, okay, so poor white trailer parks and poor black people get disproportionately punished by these aggregates. Now I bring this up because I've really pushed back on one current trend in critical race theory as expressed by who I consider its most reasonable and least mockable advocate. Not Robin DiAngelo, who I treat as a joke, but Abraham X. Kendi. And Abraham X. Kendi's been big on pushing for intersectional reasons, recollapsing all the kinds of racism back into just racism because they all inform each other and policy's never neutral and this, that, and the other. My response to that has always been, that makes sense because implicit bias, structural bias, compounded structural problems, all right, and bigotry, they interrelate, but they aren't the same, and you don't disentangle them the same way. Like, even for example, let's say we got rid of your observation that, like, you only hire people you know, which compounds a whole lot of racial problems. Let's say you just did blind hiring. It actually wouldn't fix the problem that I noticed in the way the insurance companies treated black communities, because that's a problem of wealth. Another thing I pointed out recently, I don't know if this video will have come out by the time I release this, but I talked about the white versus black wealth gap. And I'm like, it's not insignificant. It's actually huge, but it's only 200,000 K a year, which sounds like a lot until you look at house prices. And it's literally, the wealth gap is about home ownership and requisite house value. Like, and if you fix that, it would almost go away within most people. Now, there's another huge gap between like wealthy black families and wealthy white families where you have literally 200 years difference in accumulation.
Mm-hmm.
That's a separate problem. But for most people, what the wealth gap is tied to is assets tied into homes.
Yeah.
So again, like, it's a big wealth gap, but it's actually, that one's a policy fix that isn't super hard if you disaggregate it from the large wealth gap, which is about like really the top 10% of income earners in every category. And so my point about intersectionality is like, I'm not against it at all. In fact, I'm not, like, I always talk about how I'm class first, but not class reductionist. I realize that race is not deducible to merely a class position. It isn't just that. Interestingly, just as a historical note, I think it emerges at the same time as our modern conceptions of class over a period from like basically 1472 to like in Europe until about the 20th century. I mean, it's a long construction, but and one that's still contested. Like,
Yeah.
our Arabs white, our Persians white, our Portuguese, who invented the fucking concept of right in the first place, ironically in America, weren't considered white until like in most jurisdictions until like the 60s. Like,
yeah, I mean, I I don't know where I fall on this. I I just reject I reject the binary of in some sense, right? Because the kind of, when we're talking about, like, I guess what you're saying, I need to read that book, I guess, the Kindi book, right, about the argument for collapsing all
that's in his
conceptions
How
of
Not to
race.
Be an Anti-Racist. That's so when I take issue with Kindi, his first book, Stand from the Beginning, which is a popularization of like racial history, I think it's actually
Uh-huh.
a good book. I think it's a
Uh-huh.
good book. I think it's sound. His second book, How to Be an Anti-Racist, I think is where there's more problems. Some of them are tactical, like saying we should get rid of anti-discrimination clauses so we can discriminate for race, which I think is like, that's an idiotic understanding of how power works. Like you think that, I think it thinks that you think that liberal people are in control of a lot more than you think they are
Uh-huh.
if you're going to do that. But also, I think it flattens out dangers too. Like, because if you start taking the racial framework and start applying it to other categories like sexuality in the same way, I'm like, you're gonna build an anti-solidaristic framework with that very quickly. I mean, and I think the whole Chappelle argument was a sign of that from like 3 years ago during the beginning of the pandemic about he thought trans people is like white people colonizing the oppression of black people. Basically, that's part of his argument.
Uh-huh.
And I'm like, well, from the standpoint of everything is either pro or anti-racist, and from the standpoint that you should discriminate to mitigate racism, you're actually turning this into a near zero-sum competition battle, which actually undoes any benefit to intersectionality as far as like building solidarity and understanding that. Which is why a lot of Marxists now like utterly reject it, is because they think intersectionality is inherently anti-solidaristic.
Yeah.
Which
No,
to me is just a conceptual framework, but whatever.
yeah, I agree. I mean, like, I think that, and that's why I was brought up that knapsack article, because I think that it is it kind of represents, as you say, the kind of, unfortunately, vulgarization maybe of what, like, of what people think of as intersectionality that is not particularly based on the actual concept.
Yeah.
And
I mean, that's what, when people teach it, that's what they teach. They don't go and tell you to look at Crenshaw.
No, and because it's, and the Crenshaw thing, like, to me, I was excited when I first heard about it, because I thought of it, I was like, okay, people are getting into complexity, right? People are starting to think people are like, you know, it's obviously the most basic concept of complexity, right? That like that totality is greater than the sum of its parts, right? Or might take a different form, or have, you know, fundamentally different characteristics, right?
Yeah, that was my hope and inclination originally. As first time I heard about uh, Kimberly Shaw's initial work and how what it like exposed as a legal framework. And I remember getting a fight with Doug Lane, kind of infamous fight at a conference, where I'm like, "You're criticizing, you know, intersectionality for not being revolutionary. Well, who the fuck thought it was? Like, it's just a way to understand like the way people might be discriminated against in terms of law and systems when you
Yeah,
have multiple things combining, but it
I mean,
doesn't actually make any call to like, it doesn't even inherently invoke privilege discourse, which is a whole different problem.
no,
But
no. I mean, and ultimately, what it does, I think, what one way to read it, right,
mm-hmm.
is as a critic, as a critical stance or perspective on the reification of categories that the law imposes, right?
Mm-hmm.
So the law is only able to see things in this completely linear way that is like not even, you know, that is politically built. You know, the problem is that what is our conception of race is not always clear, right? Like, you know,
Yeah, I
and
mean,
how the law should apply the post civil rights uh, amendments
our
is
Latin and Arab
politically,
racial categories, for example, is not clear at all. Like,
yeah.
um,
You know, and you know, these things were written in the era of basically scientific race theory, right?
right.
Uh,
Although strict, so why some of this matters is like you're right about reifications of law, but let's like get into the Supreme Court here a little bit.
okay.
um the conservative court made up the strict scrutiny thing to like reject something in the 80s. I think
Sure.
it was like was it the Burger Court? I think it was the Burger Court. um and I forget the specific case, but it was basically to reject a racial discrimination claim, so they came up with this like category based scrutiny argument with like, okay, so minorities who are oppressed, and the reason why we have to give them special status is because they're minorities, because they can't make up a valid voter bloc, so we have to read them strictly. Then there are groups like women who are historically oppressed but are not a minority, so theoretically could advocate for themselves, so we have to give them intermediate. And then like everybody else we have to give like broad deference to the government or something, right? which which I think when I explained this to somebody who was like a constitutional law purist, they're like, what? And I'm like, yeah, the Supreme Court, they just made it up. Like,
I
they
mean,
made up a new category test, but yeah. Like,
yeah. I get, but yeah, exactly. I mean, but the point kind of, yeah. Eh, I mean, I guess, yeah, exactly. So their but even if we take that scrutiny category or the racial understanding from the creation of those amendments, right? It's not it doesn't automatically apply in a clear way, right? And so what
mm-hmm.
the Crenshaw article talking about how the margins, people who are at this intersectional margin are left out. You know, it's a critique kind of two things, right? It's a critique of this kind of these racial categories. Like, I'm saying we can read it from a complexity perspective as this critique of reification. I don't think that's necessarily what it is. I mean, I think in a lot of ways what she's applying it to basically a kind of, you know, industrial. I mean, the irony of it, it's you know, it's the critique of an industrial economy that is hiring, that is like, that interprets a call for racial equality as only applied to men for blackness, right? And then
Mm-hmm.
that is and then
gender equality only applied to gender broadly in ways that tend to favor white women.
Yeah, and just I think that it's clear that basically white women are the prime recipients of affirmative action thus far, right?
Like don't white women, and you'll bro here because I'm off-white. So like so white ethnics like Irish, Catholics, Jews, etc., are fully integrated in also of affirmative action, even though they're not the justification for it, right? Like that. But the biggest beneficiary is basically white women, but secondarily is it completes the expansion of whiteness to all the off-white hordes.
And so
with the exception of Muslim ones.
Yeah. I mean, that's a kind of post 2001 phenomenon, right? But yeah, so I mean, interesting story about that actually is I remember hearing that they were transferring a bunch of people to one of these like super prisons because there were too many Muslims. And so they just started putting like activists basically and people in there who were security threats, because of their like communications or whatever. So that even the BOP is cognizant of their of their racial demographics. But yeah, I mean, so I guess that's to me that's what's interesting. Like to take intersectionality into the realm of like actually trying to break down like what we're trying to think about, right? And what are the social practices that are replicating race is what got that's the kind of train that I went down, which I don't think is the predominant kind of training, and that's why the Macintosh thing is useful. Yeah, I mean, I brought it in because it's like I feel like that's the way where we're just taking these legal categories and just accepting them, right? And
even flattening them down from their legal like I mean it's race in America is actually interesting because if it wasn't for legality, it would even be a regional question. Like, for example, in the 1990s, an influx of Latin and Asian immigrants like broke the way my public school handled categorizing race because it was binary. It literally was. We're counting black students and we're counting
in the Southeast.
Yeah, in the Southeast, and we're counting white students, and Latin and basically Latin students have to pick. Are you white or are you black? There's a pushback against this in the early 90s. Like, they integrated my prom court because we're like, well, if we only have a black and white prom team, how are the Latin American students or whatever going to be involved? My school was actually relatively racially progressive because while they segregated their prom court, they had an interracial prom. The reason why the prom court was segregated is because they didn't want the forced miscegenation on the prom king and queen. Fucked up. It absolutely fucked up. But it was a binary system. Like, whereas in the Northeast and the West, it has never been a binary system, like, at all. I mean, Chicanos are their own thing. Interestingly, when you talk about Latin people, one of the things that we have to deal with now is there's an increasing division between those who identify themselves as like white Hispanic and those who don't. Because Latin is not a racial category, except it kind of is, except it isn't. But one of the things that became interesting in the South that I just, about the paradoxes of racial inclusion and disclusion is and I don't think this is driving it. I think it's epiphenomenal, but I did not experience a lot of anti-Latin bigotry as a child. It just wasn't really part of the lexicon, right? It was mostly black, white. That's it. About 6 or 7 years after you started seeing like, okay, we're now recognizing this Latin thing as like this quasi category, and we're not going to make you and pick sides or whatever. You don't have to declare yourself white or black. You can be your own thing. Mm-hmm. That actually becomes coterminous with anti-immigration sentiment and then anti-Latino sentiment in general. Mm-hmm. And so there are a lot of people who had experienced themselves as like, well, you know, I'm pretty integrated into this, you know, white community, basically. And now in my teens and 20s, I'm not anymore. Like, and I find that interesting. Whereas when I traveled in the Northeast, like the fact that there was like, I'm going to say ethnicism, not racism, but like the fact that you could still, as late as the 1990s, like have Polish Catholic versus Italian Catholic ethnic tensions is like, to a Southerner, is like, y'all are white. Like, what are you doing? Like, and so, but the legal categories flatten that out. Like, they apply it to the entirety of the nation, and they have to, because this is mostly a category of federal law. Although, again, and interestingly, you want to talk about some of the ironies of this. Northeastern schools and Western schools are more segregated than Southern schools because the Supreme Court decided that you only really needed to enforce integration actively with a strict scrutiny clause, not like just encourage busing kind of, was in former Confederate states. So like New York and Detroit are way more school segregated and public schools than say anyone in a southern city until you started having massive right flight in the odds.
Yeah, I mean, predominant. There are definitely some northern counties that were under
federal. Were busing and got federal intervention. Yeah, I know that, but they were not under the same scrutiny level. Like,
I'm not sure.
No, I'm absolutely certain on that because I know education law.
Okay. Okay.
So, like, what I mean by that, like, they would get civil rights violations, but you had to maintain like proportional population in your schools in the Southeast. Like, so for example, let's say you have a school that's like 50-50, but you're in a 60-40 county, 60% black, 40% white county, you're going to get in trouble. That's not going to be the case in the Northeast. But busing was forced on both of them, depending.
Yeah, I mean, I
our legal structures are so fucking weird too.
No, I mean, like, I live in New York City. It's like has some of the most, maybe the most segregated school system, right? So
I've heard it's either it or Detroit. It goes back and forth on who's more segregated. Like,
so yeah, it's. I mean, and interestingly enough, I mean, this is kind of where a lot of that stuff comes from, right? It comes from the coin. The term critical race theory, right, mostly comes out of Derick Bell and Kimberly Crenshaw, who's, I believe, a student of Derick Bell's. But I mean, I guess I was technically a student of Derick Bell's also. But I took his constitutional law class. But and his trajectory is as a litigator in school desegregation, right, and then his kind of, there's a sense of the kind of, there's a sense of the tragic in him, in that he just kind of saw that it didn't work, right? That this kind of, to me, it has it.
The James Baldwin, Cyril L. Hurston critique of the school integration wasn't entirely out of nowhere. It wasn't entirely reactionary. Like,
yeah, I mean, no, it was it was one of those things. Like, I think the Brown versus Board of Education did cause a collapse of Black teaching, right? Because
Absolutely.
they closed the Black schools, right?
Let me like explain my personal experiences. I had a lot of Black teachers. Do you know why I had a lot of Black teachers? They all came in during the like they were all old. They were like I had a bunch of. They felt ancient to me. They probably were actually like Black teachers who had been trained in the 60s and were like the last people trained for the segregated school system, even though it was supposed to be over by then, but it wasn't. Like you really didn't get it truly integrated until the 70s. I'm coming up in the 80s and 90s in the South, and so these women are in their 50s, 60s, and 70s, but they're still in the schools. Mm-hmm. As they leave, so when I come back to start teaching in the aughts, they're all retired because they're getting really old. There are almost nobody who replaces them. Mm-hmm. They do get some Black teachers. What I will tell you about this in terms of intersectionality and my view on it, the Black teachers who replaced them were socioeconomically from even higher backgrounds than like the white teachers were, mm-hmm. who are themselves usually middle to upper middle class in their background. Ironically, because school pays so low, it's like journalism internships. It pays so low that the only people who are going to do it are people who are ideologically motivated and have other means. So it's people who are married to professionals for the most part, are people who come from money, are people who are desperate. So there's also that third category are weirdos like me who are ideologically motivated but also poor. But there's not, I like my category of teacher is very, very rare. And mm-hmm. Similarly, so there's a lot of like Black teachers who were even activists, pro-Black activists, probably in the critical race theory now. However, what they said about poor Black kids was shocking even to me, who've been used to being around white people most of the time. Like they would say things that I would know no white teacher would say, and it was class derived. Mm-hmm. Like they would just talk about like thug trash basically all mm-hmm. the time when it wasn't an official capacity. And I mean, I wouldn't have heard it from those teachers who I grew up with, but those teachers who I was taught by in the South in the 90s, who were all old Black teachers who came up, were trained for the segregated schools more or less. They also came up from poorer Black communities. They were not like the children of the Black bourgeoisie and professional class. Mm-hmm. They were like people who got an associate's degree and got grandfathered in, and had thought they were serving a Black community. And like I said, we had way more Black teachers when they were around than later when they were like, well, we got to get whoever's going to do this. And who's going to do this? Well, it's going to be somebody probably married well, or who's ideologically motivated as some kind of Black improvement thing or something like that. And that also started that begins the trend in the South where like you have increased because of white flight into private schools in a lot of these areas. My school district didn't have that, ironically, just because there was no private school in the county.
Right. No academies?
No academies, no religious academies, nothing. So, wow. And there is no charter school still. So it was the only option if you didn't want to drive to another county. And the county is quite large. It's an hour across. So my school remained a like 55, 40, or like a 55 to 60 minority, 40% white school. Whereas most of the other schools in the area, even though those areas were off, they would often do magnet schools. The magnet schools would be predominantly white, and then they have to move them around because they get in trouble with the feds. And it became where those schools have majority white teaching staffs, but their student body is like 80 to 90% Black, even though the area is not that. It's like 60 to 70% Black. Every white family that can has sent their kids to private school. And so you have this like denigration dynamic. This made me very aware of the problems with these legal categories, but also with attempts to fix them because they tended to have really pernicious side effects, like okay, now we have a all white, or not all white, but we have like a 80% white teaching staff and an 80% black student body, and so there's like very little social trust between the two groups.
Mm-hmm.
um you know, what are you going to do? And I started seeing this as a function of like partially law and partially economics, because the other thing that became very clear to me is like, well, who becomes teachers? People who don't have strong academic backgrounds, and kind of becomes an option to them because they went to college with like first generation college students, but those tend to be white, and from like formerly white working class families in the liberal sense of that term,
Mm-hmm.
and people who are married well, and this is an ideological, our sociological mission for them. And like that actually makes up a core a lot of the baby boomer teachers who are still there, and those people have not been replaced. So you end up with these pernicious like shifts. And the other thing I could say is like a lot of black students outside of sports and get a lot of other kinds of opportunities, not because people were actively discriminating against them, but because like you have students with 2 or 3 generations of like background knowledge of like academic stuff and how that works to go into these like say theater or honors classes or whatever, and black students are not being encouraged to do that, or like outside of the school.
Mm-hmm.
um and so this divide gets worse and worse and worse, even internal to the school itself. So you start having like almost segregation within the same school, like
Oh
these
yeah.
elite like
I mean, I
uh
definitely experienced that in public school in Maryland, where the same school has not sometimes explicitly tracked, but like sometimes just implicitly, right? Like and that's like kind of that, and that's it's all those factors that you're talking about, right? Parent pressure and kind of testing and all that stuff, right?
one of the things when conservatives are complaining about the lack of honors classes, and my response to that is, you know what, you have a point, rigor's going down, you're absolutely correct. Let me tell you though, your honors classes haven't been rigorous since the 90s. What honors classes now track is just like parental involvement to push kids in the honors classes and
Mm-hmm.
behavior. That's all it tracks. When I look at like test scores or reading lexile or whatever, the difference between the honor students and non-honor students is like minimal. But in behavioral reports and referrals to the office when you're in person, uh, they're astronomically different. So that's why there's been a move to get rid of them. Reasons for that are complicated, right? Um, but I get why someone like Derick Bell will become disillusioned. Like, well, okay, now we have to come up with another theory for why school integration didn't work. Um,
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of that God that failed phenomenon. It feels like, right? That
mhm,
it's that I mean, if you've invested so much time and energy and hope and passion into a project, and then to watch, you know, to watch it just utterly not succeed, right? In terms of a grander vision, right? Like
mhm,
obviously, but and that's kind of the bigger picture, right? That's the bigger scene, right? Even in terms of if we're talking about school integration or the civil rights, um, civil rights legal reforms, right? It's under it's with the background of the gorilla in the room, or it's like the background is the industrialization, right, and a completely changing economy, right, and so you have this inevitable kind of mismatch happening where and because the reforms go far enough, but you still have you still have that those economic changes and schools that are fundamentally tied to that in their funding, right?
Well, and this leads to, I mean, like, we're talking about this in terms of race, but let's talk about this in terms of gender and like weird things that have happened. Uh, so Gabriel Winant did a good book that I suggest people read on what happened to the post-industrial cities and the hospital complexes that kind of developed under Fordism. When there's a shift from breadwinners from like industrial workers to nurses, like to the lower PMC or whatever. Terms I hate, but I do think we have to like look at something here. And if you look at where all the hospital concentrations are, it's not even about like wealth. It's like, where was the industrial area? There's going to be like 85 hospitals there, and where there isn't. That dramatically affected the northeastern Black community too, because of a couple things. Deindustrialization. I think we have to admit that our incarceration policies around drugs were at least tolerated because they got rid of a lot of surplus population. Like, I'm not saying that's why. I don't have a conspiracy view. I don't think that's why they were passed, but I think that's why it took so long to get rid of them when they didn't have an effect.
Well, but I mean, we did. We haven't gotten rid of them, right? And
we've kind of gotten rid of some of them a little bit, not really. Like,
but and what you say is right, that it's the conspiracy is it's like with everything. I feel like with conspiracy theory, the conspiracy is actually in the cover up, and in this case, that analogy applies to the conspiracy is in the like the that it doesn't disrupt, that it helps, right? It helps maintain the system. It becomes a kind of glue, right? That it's like, oh, no one's going to say we're removing surplus labor, right? But like, it's also not collapsing anything. It's keeping things together, right? So,
well, how do you regulate surplus labor? You extend school for fucking ever. Like, why would the PMC class be expanded to 40% of the workforce when a lot of service sector jobs that require degrees didn't used to require degrees at all? They don't need it.
Yeah.
So why would they do that? Well, this is where this is not a part of planning. No one sat down and planned this, but you're getting a flood of applicants. How do you shut them out?
Yeah.
You start adding credentializations just to remove people from the pool. Similarly, why is it taking so long to really push back on drug war stuff? This to me is a loss. One of the things that I bemoan the BLM is going directly to defunding the police, which I shake because even as a prison abolitionist, I thought that was not wise. But anyway, you take the money. I've said this a million times on my show, but you take the money away from the people with the guns and they still have the guns. That's a dumb idea.
No,
that's a very dumb idea.
I mean, when I was doing my podcast more often, that was one of we did an episode on disarm the police, right?
Right. like you want to really have an effect. The actually police anti-mutilization and anti-drug war stuff would have been more immediately effective, even if your goal was like police abolition in the long run. Like, because trying to do police abolition through funding when they still have all the military equipment.
And the funding. I mean, the funding thing is really important because it's another glue that keeps things together, right? Because what you're saying, like, just if we think about it geographically, right? Mm-hmm. This I learned just kind of from, diving into kind of tax codes and about education and policing. It applies, right? So geographically, deindustrialization, what does it mean? It means that, well, let's start with industrialization, right? In like early 20th century, industrialization is you're building factories in cities, right? Huge geographically centralized locations. People are moving from, a lot of people, the Great Migration, moving into industrial centers, right? And building factories, right? And working in factories, right? And relatively, and then the schools are built off of the tax base of those municipalities, right?
Right.
And you have the glory age, you know, and you know, this culminates in the golden age of American public schooling, you know, the immediate post World War II.
And then add
era.
the fucking baby boom into that.
Add the baby boom, add huge DoD funding, right? You have this total bubble economy of education, right? In a sense, right? But geographically, the way that falls apart is that the jobs are dispersed and taken away from those industrial centers and replaced with service sectors in what? Education, healthcare, right? Nonprofit. These are nonprofit entities that do not pay taxes, right?
Right.
So you're doubly.
You lose your tax base, and I mean, like Macon, Georgia, for example, public hospitals, churches, and schools are the largest employers, so there's no tax base. Yeah. And when people like, you know, people go, well, MMT, you don't need a tax base. Municipalities and states do. They don't have currency sovereignty. They actually do have limitations.
No, but and I mean, even from the MMT thing, like, it's not like there's increased federal funding as this is happening, right? It's decreasing, right?
Exactly.
And then you know, so you have this double effect going on, but there's just no, like, there's no normative legal response to that phenomenon, right?
Right. Then I think we have to add another thing to this, is like, okay, northern minority communities, particularly Black community, are highly industrialized. Where do they go when that ends? Well, the people who are able to get decent jobs go into municipal work, busing, the DoD, department, not the DoD, the department, the DOT, Department of Transportation, like the post office, because they actually do, they have to, the implicit bias stuff is less, cannot affect their hiring practices as much, because they're actually monitored more closely by the federal government because of federal jobs. This is an actually interesting thing to think about. However, in the South, that it didn't happen the same way. It does happen to some degree. Like if you go to a Southern, you know, DMV, it's going to be mostly staffed by Black people. But the Black community there was never industrialized unless it left. Because another thing that we're not talking about is because of fears of, well, has complex reasons, and part of it's also keeping the white population down. But the South was deliberately not industrialized until very late. And when it was industrialized in the shittiest form of industrialization, which is textiles, and then like paper mills, and stuff like that. So a lot of the Black community that remained in the South, between Jim Crow and this general deindustrialization or non-industrialization in the Southeast in the first place, never had access to that to begin with. And so you had generations of people in the 80s, like, and my babysitter as a kid was one of these women who had no access to education, or very little access to education in the 30s and 40s, who were shut out. Didn't even have, like, a lot of them didn't even have social security numbers. So they were literally like shut out of a whole lot of like federal aid programs and stuff because they didn't have it. It wasn't given to them. They didn't have birth certificates a lot of the time. And shit like that. Like, I think people don't realize that was still, like, these women were still, mostly women, were still around in the 70s and 80s. And that was the backbone of a lot of, like, what we would call, like, the Black community in the South. And that's why church stuff became so important, because these people were totally shut out of most forms of, like, economic aid. A lot of it from explicit publicity, but some of it was like, by the time we get into the 80s and 90s, it's just like, we haven't fixed these problems that are from like 50 years ago.
I mean, it's it's the New Deal never finished, right?
Right, like the new
And the last people to get it were
were
right.
black people, and in some ways Southern black people never got it. Like
Uh-huh.
that's the thing. Like it's like, I mean, it was also true that like if you were like, to put it into some perspective, in the 60s, if you were a black worker in the Northeast, you actually did better than an ununionized white industrial worker in the South. But the white industrial worker in the South was doing worlds better
Mm-hmm.
than the black family too. So this leads to this weird, like, I think this is something I would just bring up because this is something particular to the South that intersectionality doesn't deal with as much as I would like. Is regional effects really matter, particularly
Mm-hmm.
when deindustrialization hits? Because some of these areas have had these problems for decades, and some have them for the first time.
Yeah. So this is a good background to go back to the thing that we
Mhm.
started with, right?
Yeah.
Because you've been in rooms um,
Hmm.
where people have done these exercises, and the
Yep.
conversation is not actually that complex, right? and
Nope.
that's part of the problem, right? Like what I'm struggle with is like, I've been in these rooms and I've seen the dynamics that are brought out by like the backpack exercise and what have you, and like for some people it's incredibly revelatory, and for
Yes.
other people, I mean, I think mostly for kind of like for the people maybe it was intended for, I'm not sure, but for like upper middle class white women particularly, right, and men, I think, right, like
Hmm.
that. But then for everyone else, it's like either
Professional men. I
yeah.
will say upper middle class professional men. Yes,
But
but
what I've also noticed is like you know I don't know if it's particularly affirming for most like everyone else, and like I've definitely seen it be pretty much alienating to like working class or like basically white people who are not upper middle class or middle class, right?
yeah, and
Um,
I think increasingly it's also alienating to people of color who are not upper middle class too. But that's new. I think that's a
yeah,
new thing.
yeah. I mean, I like I've had these experiences with these things, and kind of a mixed bag, frankly. If the conversation that happens is good, maybe it's interesting, but you know what, because as so when we're thinking about how do we create maybe or how would we want to see a better implementation of that kind of conversation starter, right?
I don't know. I mean, I'll tell you my experiences when I went into teacher training, and this is an experience
Yeah,
that's been replicated now in critical. This was pre-critical race theory being commonly taught. Right?
yeah.
I was exposed to plenty the Peggy McIntosh, but then we went through a class about racial statistics, and it was the only class in my entire life in college where no one was allowed to speak. We were not allowed to discuss it. We were just taught it.
Interesting.
And because I thought that we'd start derailing, so that, and I was like, so you have to. I was literally like, you have so little faith in us for whatever reason, and these are liberal people. These are people who are entering this profession for those reasons, that you literally think we have to be inert and silent. And we weren't being taught by like black professors. It was a white professor lecturing us and telling us to stay silent off of a set of statistics. It was written by a black writer, but there wasn't even like racial representation in how this was presented to us, and we were told to sit down and shut up. All right. um that we shouldn't derail it. Now, I was still pretty idealist at this time, and I was also just coming out of being a conservative. But this, I was like, my first response is, you're so afraid of this that you're telling good liberal people that they can't even debate what you're teaching them because you're afraid they're all crypto racist. And I'm like, well, they may be crypto racist, but this will do nothing, absolutely nothing to undo it. And most of these people are already on board, like, about privilege discussions. But I will tell you what happened when you tried to take it out of the educational context of people in graduate degrees is you started talking about privilege, and white people would just poor white people would shut down because they're just like, I don't have the same privilege as that other white person. Like, I don't. And over time, I came to like, you know what? They're right. They don't. And when I first glommed onto intersectionality, I was like, Crenshaw just gave me a way to talk about this.
Mm-hmm.
But we don't. The way intersectionality was already being talked about by the end of the aughts, it did not treat white people that way and almost took out class from the discussion entirely because class is barely a legal category.
Yeah. Well, yeah, exactly. Class is not a legal category. Geography is not a legal category. You know, the zip code is not a legal category. I mean, you know, for discrimination purposes, but those are the things that inform what the relevant. You know, I mean, time is not a legal category for this
Yeah,
purpose,
it really doesn't
right?
matter like when you were X thing too, doesn't it?
Right.
Like,
and so all of these things matter for the relevant understanding and for, you know, like, you know, like obviously you can add those things in, but I think that, I mean, I guess ultimately I think that privilege is just the wrong framing, right? Privilege is not actually going to get, because privilege requires a binary understanding of it's a good or a bad, right? A privilege is not a spectrum, or, you know, it's not a nuanced category, right? Like,
right. It's not only just binary. It has a pernicious implication that I point out to people that I'm like, you're also assuming that the shitty marginalized state is actually the default state.
exactly, right? What you know, what it does is it sneaks in an actual belief in meritocracy, right? Because the what kind of privileges are there? There's earned privileges and there's unearned privileges, right?
And
Like,
earned privileges are okay in this discourse.
right, exactly. So being white gives you an unearned privilege, but that's just not, like, that makes no sense. Like, social on, like, ontologically, that makes no sense, right? Like, being white is how a white person exists. Right.
Right, and this led to this
So
punching down thing that I like. Even I had a friend of mine from the South who lived abroad for a long time, and literally said to me like, "Well, with all the advantages given to white people, I don't know like any white person who's not ahead is their own fault." And I was like, "That's absurd."
you know, but
Like,
exactly, like meritocracy, you know, it's just like, it's like your racial categorization is to some degree how you see yourself, but in for these conversations, for this understanding, it's mostly how others see you, right?
right.
That's not, has nothing to do with being earned or not. Right. so I think that the privilege is the problem, right? Like, as a category for for increasing our depth of understanding, right?
So I will talk about how I think privilege discourse became dominant, because what I think it does is it's an attempt to throw into one concept some other sociological concepts. You may or may not have a problem with them from like my Marxist perspective or your perspective or whatever. Social capital, cultural capital, actual capital, the wages of race, to use a term, get all flat, and the wages of gender, sex get all flattened into one category.
Yeah.
And
no, I think social capital is a better concept for dealing with this, right?
Right. Yeah. I mean, I even distinguish it between tie and the social capital, frankly, because it's like, and this becomes a huge problem. You know, and however, I will say, and this is where I'm going to turn on my Marxist friends a little bit, because I told you in the beginning, I'm class first. I think class actually is for most people's experience the predominant thing that affects their actual even phenomenological experience, like where you are on the money scale. One of the reasons I talk about this
on
is
what
like
scale?
on the money scale and on
Okay.
where you are in the production circuit, right? So those two things both matter. And race and gender both matter, but One thing that I just think is a sociological reality that like someone like Adolf Reed talks about, I think correctly, is like, well, if you're a black elite, what's your most what's the biggest hindrance in your life? It is racism. It's absolutely racism. It's real. It's aimed at you, and it's the only thing aimed at you. If you're a black woman,
Well,
I mean,
unless you are confused for a lower status
right,
person, in which case what might be aimed at you is a gun, right?
Right, but that's the thing, is like the racial thing can function as a proxy for class, but it's the reason why it exists is racial, right?
Yeah.
But it leads people to, like, I remember when Toni Morrison was like, I will cry when a white kid gets shot like a black kid. She said this for real, and I was like, then just look at the fucking stats. That happens all the time. That should not be what you're worried about. Like, poor white kids get shot. What you're saying is it's okay for them to shoot poor people as long as it's the reason it's not because they're black. And I'm like that was when I started realizing the privilege of discourse. I'm like, one, it normalizes that the implicit violence of the system is justified. It just shouldn't be because of something you can't control, like your race. And I'm like, well, you can't control a whole lot of stuff. Like, there's more than race that you can't control. And then I started realizing, to get back to my point with the Marxists who reduced class to race. So like, oh, but they're getting treated, as a black person, because as a black person, it's like you're being treated as you're a class down, and it's really a class marker. And I'm like, yeah, but these people still have the economic power, so you can't really conflate one to the other. Like Will Smith may be mistaken and mistreated by a cop because he is black, right? But if he wasn't famous, but he still has the power of the money and status that he has. That is still real. You don't take that away from him because someone might mistake it at some time. Like,
and that's that is like, the only thing that ignores though is the kind of subjective experience, right? And the subjective experience is obviously very real for a lot of people, and so that and whatever kind of and that's how this affects the kind of imagination, right? Like, which is actually part of I think in some sense is part of a material analysis, right?
Right. Well, yeah, I think we have to, because this is one of the things I was trying to, actually, when I was talking to my socialist friends, I was trying to give them sympathy for, like, why the quote black PMC or whatever, I'm gonna put all that in quotations, would be that way. And I'm like, because that experience it's not like they're making it up. And it isn't just that it's like a means for power and a shrinking pie, although it is. That is still true. All right. Yeah. It is also that it is the primary way they experience domination and oppression, is through race. Whereas a poor black person experiences all the racial bigotry, but then everything else, and sees other people who do not look like them in similar situations, which is why the Pew polls always say, like, every black person says racism is a problem. But how profoundly they see racism as the primary problem actually does move up. It becomes an increasing part of the worldview, the higher up on the class status you go, unless you get like super, super rich. But
also I think that it's, I think it's also kind of impossible to disambiguate, right? I mean, like, this is part of the conundrum of racism as a subjective experience, right? Like, you never know. Is it racist? Is it
racism, or is this some other structural precedent? Is this racism, or is this person a dick?
Yeah, exactly. Is it racism, or is it because I look like crap today? Is it racism, or is it just bad luck, right? And so kind of discourses, I think, and availability of any particular framework for understanding is what's going to, I think, have a pretty you know, like a poll is just going to kind of dip into that. It's not going to really give you a fleshed out kind of, you know what
Absolutely.
I mean? So, but yeah.
Well,
So
this brings us up to something we talked about in the beginning that maybe we should go back to when I was talking about my critique of standpoint epistemology.
yeah,
Like, my basic level of standpoint epistemology is true. If someone tells you they think they're experiencing racism, one, I'm going to bracket out which kind. Like, who knows? You should believe that they feel they're experiencing racism, and you should validate that. Does that mean that they understand your intentions? No, but that's irrelevant. I'm not worried about people. You can't know a person's heart. All right. That's a qualitative, experiential, and subjective experience that we should take at face value. Person says they experience racism, we should generally trust them unless we have some very profound reason not to, like a history of just making shit up.
yeah.
The structural experience of racism, though, I do think, as we talked about at the beginning, is blind. So we have to, when we talk about like validizing this, even in our discussion, we talk about privilege or racial privilege or whatever, it flattens out even that distinction, because like I can believe someone is being qualitatively honest to me about how they're experiencing racism and yet be blind to all the structures that are inculcating that. Like those are actually two separate questions. And that is also true for gender. And when it comes to class discrimination, now class is where it gets weird, admittedly. When it comes to class discrimination or classism, which is a separate thing than structural class struggle, I also have the same point of view. If you think someone's being a snob to you, then I'm going to trust that as an experience. Does it mean I know the other person's intention? Absolutely not. You can't. Like, what I find is interesting, and maybe class is a good way to understand this, because I think people do kind of get, if you take 30 seconds to say classism and class struggle are not the same thing. One is about like social capital mongering, but somebody could be completely unclassist and treat me as a human being, just like somebody can be completely unracist and treat me as a human being. And yet the moment that we enter into this other structural canard, it doesn't, like, they're still perpetuating the system regardless of how they personally treat me. Like, I've had good bosses. They're still fucking capitalist. Like, I think one of the things that Marxists are right about one of the, but they don't know how to deal with it in terms of race, right? And they don't know how to deal with it in terms of nationality either, but that's a whole nother problem. Is that you could theoretically have a capitalism that was racially fair. Now, in the actual human development of capitalism, that's not how it happened, and that's not possible. But as a structural counterfactual, you can. And in fact, there are time periods where capital is going to be probably a relatively progressive force in terms of race, but may not be in other ways. And talking about the kind of multi-factor analysis that something like intersectionality started to give you with Crenshaw gives you a way to see like that moving around, why that would move around in a complex way. But I guess the question happens is, even like, well, yeah, we're coming down on McIntosh, but even Crenshaw doesn't really deliver on the promise of that ultimately. Like,
yeah, I mean, I guess I want to tease this out a little bit about the, you know, because, you know, I think the capitalism thing, in what, I mean, like when you say you could theoretically have a capitalism that doesn't produce racism, I wonder, in maybe an ideal sense, but like in on a planet where people look different, is it possible? Because I would think maybe not.
Okay, okay, it might, but it might not look like white racism.
No.
The dominant, let's say for some reason, like capitalism's dominance moves totally to Asia. Like,
No,
it
I
might
do
not
think
replicate the white power discourse that we have around race.
yeah. Okay. Yeah, because I think that the encounter, uneven development, and any form of phenotypic difference, I think probably inherently produces racism.
So this is an important point. So I've always said there's always capitalism needs an excluded other to be the primary person that it tends to throw in the surplus population, but that could be any group. I mean, theoretically, and I'm not saying this is true, but it could be like poor white people could be that group eventually. Who knows? It's not likely, but it is possible.
Well, poor white people did. I mean, I don't know. If
they started off as that group for one thing.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I don't know if you saw. I remember reading what's his name, Keenan Malik, having some excerpt from 150 years ago or something in England describing working class, what we would call white people, as swarthy or some kind, basically describing them in a completely racialized way, as if they were a different race, right? So it's like, yeah, no, I think that the category is not static at all.
The
right?
racialization of white people is kind of interesting. I mean, for one, like, let's be honest, white people is a useful settler colonial construct that
makes the most sense in Americas.
Right. It makes the most sense in the Americas. It doesn't, like, it kind of makes sense in Europe when they want to be united, but when you really pushing it, just like as white people, British people really hate Slavs and
oh my
don't
God.
consider them
not
white.
Just British.
Yeah, a whole lot of. Whereas Americans are like, they just have weird names, but
yeah. No, I mean, I was shocked. It's interesting for me. When I go to Europe, I the experience of racism is so different, right? The older I get, the less kind of I used to get more, especially a few times in the South, more just your classic old racism, right? Like good old American racism. But traveling in Europe, what was shocking was kind of the first glance racism is are you Middle Eastern, and it's classed as the lowest class, right? But what I was shocked with was spending time in Sweden, and it's they're pretty, with just there's some,
on racial attitude polls, Sweden's the least racist place in Europe, and yet it's still
the shit they said about Serbians is unspeakable, right? It's they didn't the people I met didn't hate anyone more than they hated Serbians.
I mean, and I think this is something we have to kind of deal with on the Capitol, but also I'm gonna say something that's gonna make Marxists a little uncomfortable. I don't think just anti-capitalism deals with this problem because it's rooted in symbolic kinship, which is deeper than capital. It doesn't have to be racial. And in fact, for most of human history, what we would call racism does not resemble modern racism because it's not about skin tone. It's about religion and/or language. But, and it's real funny, it's real funny with the concept of white people encountering Asianness because it took them forever to make them another race. It actually took a long time.
Because again, what is race is not, it doesn't mean the same thing. You know what I mean? You talk about the kind of 500-year history of modern racial categories, but
who are the first racial categories in Europe before you deal with the black slave trade, which is the big one. The other one is crypto Jews and crypto Muslims in Spain who get racialized as new Christians, but it's tied to your blood.
But I mean, is Roman or Greek slavery that different? I don't but
yes
but
no.
And then I think that what we I don't think, I mean, in my mind, modern racism doesn't really exist until Darwin, because our understanding of biological kinds today is 100% rooted, almost 100% rooted in a Darwinian categorization, right?
I will push back on that, but I think your impulse is still correct. I would say modern racism's racialization is also that you see it with Lamarckians and stuff too. But it is when you it is in the 19th century when you finally have another category other than religious differences or cursive ham stuff.
Yeah.
And I actually, this is another thing where I make my Marxist friends uncomfortable. It is kind of interesting that it tends to be out of Protestant countries where this happens, and Catholic countries where they still have conceptions of whiteness and rightness. I mean, literally. But whiteness in like Catholic countries was interesting because you could be granted it. Like you could get a writ of blood, which was basically it could make you overcome your casta position. And you could just like, okay, well, this black person's white now because the king says so. Like
Yeah.
that's a thing. That didn't
yeah.
exist in Protestant countries at all. Like
and you also get
Protestant
these things.
of it.
You also get these conceptions in terms of the encounter with natives of like these not even human, right? That it's a different species, right? And so I think that we're in this time where we're kind of no one really. I mean, not no one, but like the biological racism is not the official epistemology, right? But it's kind of how everyone still operates, right? It's kind of how people. It's still the kind of interestingly like 19th century like race science is now the folk wisdom of much of society. I feel like, right?
Even if will tell you that that race is socially constructed, will still ask you about your ancestry, which tells you a whole lot. Like and I say this, I go on a show that's mostly black all the time, and the big joke is I'm like, because I have physical features that looks like Sean King, and my mom looks like Sean King's mom. I get made fun of a lot as like the secret black person. My genetic ancestry, according to our modern racial pseudoscience, which I'm going to also point out,
population
genetics. Population genetics is real, but I'm like, they often get it wrong where you're from, because I've literally seen my population genetic ancestry chart since I've gotten it has changed like 5 times.
Well, because it's based on who's doing it, right?
Right, it's based off samples.
Like, it's based on it's based on a self-selected group of people who so.
Yeah, of course it does, right? So like, I have North African ancestry, whatever the fuck that means. Slavic ancestry from Bulgaria in specific. Sephardic Jewish ancestry, which overlaps with the Slavic ancestry, and Scotch Irish Welsh ancestry. Yeah. Right? However, in my experience in the world, as I like to, think of like me as like the slightly whiter Oscar Isaac. I can pass for a whole lot of groups. Mm-hmm. I get mistaken for Latino. I've been mistaken for pale Arab. I've been mistaken for other sub-ethnicities, Mediterranean, etc. When I was in Turkey, everybody assumed I didn't speak English. They would speak to me in something else. Like, I'm an American mutt, from the whole like 20th century racial blood quanta view of race. I'm all over the place. I'm not even particularly swarthy. I mean, like, I that's pretty fucking pale, but my race is constructed by other people in radically different ways. Even when I was a kid, like in the South, there was part of it's because I was poor and I lived in like basically what were predominantly black neighborhoods for most of my childhood. Not all of it, but But also there was constantly rumors by white people that I was like somehow secretly mixed race. Like, and thus I didn't count. Like, and when I would confront when all the racial theories came out later, and I was like, well, how does this affect privilege? I would literally have like rich white white anarchists who have WASP backgrounds be like, well, that's a white person problem. I'm like, but you are whiter than me, like by every metric.
Well, I mean,
like,
but conversely, right? Like, there's more like if from the blood quantum perspective, right? At least in the 70s, and I mean, it's a survey conducted that I read in the Racecraft book. There's more self-identified white people with African ancestry than black people.
Yeah.
Right. Like than there are black people, right? Because some like from a sample they did, they found that like 20-something% of white people, which is a much larger category, had African ancestry from not genetics, not from a genetic sampling, but this was a pre-genetic study where they just actually, I think, traced the ancestry, right? So it's like, because the reality. I mean and so
a lot of people eventually pass, like, and then they marry in. Like,
and so when we're talking about, yeah, exactly. So I mean, it's socially constructed in both directions, right? Like if you're talking about Sean King versus whatever, right? Like,
I mean, and then we get into like the whole colorism problem because that's a thing, and that's a one of the most discouraging things that I ever read was I was reading about everyone's like, we got to get rid of standardized tests because they're racially biased. And I was like, well, grades are racially biased. And they're like, what? I'm like, not only are they racially biased, but every study, Freddie DeBoer writes about this too. Every study I've ever seen says that they correspond not just to race, but to skin tone.
Really?
Like, and actually decoupled from IQ is racist as that is. So it's, and I'm like, so what do you like? So your grand project to remove the racial bias of standardized tests. Interestingly, the standardized tests are slightly less racially biased than just grades, because grades are purely perception based, and all the other compounding factors, like when
be careful, you're going to sound like Bill Gates and automate the teachers.
But what we already talked about in insurance, we did automate it, and it still replicates because of compounding factors.
I guess that's true.
Yeah. This is why the complexity approach to like to race and class is one I want to get into it in race. And like, this is people like, oh, you said you're going to still do race and labor. This is about race and labor. I mean, our complexity in labor. Race and labor is part of the complexity of the labor. I mean, there's other things, like we talked about regional history, talked about uneven development, even within the United States. Like there's a core and periphery to the U.S. internal to itself.
The United States is a continent.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, it's not. There's nothing even about the United States. It's a continent that was settled in like very, very specific places and expanded outwards, and the level of social and physical infrastructure was developed in according to like traceable patterns, but like certainly not evenly.
No, absolutely not. I mean, it's like the Northeast and the far west, and then the South, and if you want to get into like the industrial Midwest, I guess came up, but it's been declining. Like it's all there, and it all shows up. And I think it shows, I mean, there are interesting patterns you can deduce from this, from like complexity analysis of like social movements, for example. My favorite one is to talk about BLM. BLM always begins in the industrial Midwest, where there's a lot of black communities, and it always ends in like mostly white communities on the coast, usually like Seattle and Portland. I don't have a good theory for exactly why that is. There's not one reason. Let me rephrase that. I don't have a sophisticated enough analysis to talk about all the reasons why it is the way it is in that sense. But we can see it, and actually in that movement, we actually see a lot about like the patterns of deindustrialization.
Yeah.
We see complicated stuff about race, like because one of the things I point out to people is like if your understanding of racial oppression is the only thing you think is going on here, even in regards of BLM, why does it not break out in the South, East, way more than it does in the industrial Midwest? And because the black population in the Southeast is not only high, it's been increasing. I mean, like not just from birth rates, but also from the great what is it? The second great migration, which is the great migration post industry. Like when deindustrialization hit, a lot of the families that had moved to the Northeast from the South moved back. Like that happened
like
in the 90s and aughts, and it was like
Sunbelt
the great Sunbelt re-migration of like and I think that's an interesting like.
Well, I mean, you know, that's but so that's maybe where it's happening next, right? Depending on how. I mean, obviously, we're not clear how that economy is faring, but I think that in the long term, that's like a declining economy, right?
Well, I mean, right now, the thing with the Sun Belt is like its urban-rural divide is more pronounced, and you see this in politics too. So, like the structure of those states tend to favor rural politics, but if you like look at where the economic development is, I'm just to take Georgia because it's where I'm from, so I know it. Atlanta and Savannah are doing okay, but the other industrial areas, Augusta, Macon, and Columbus, they only survive based off their relationship to the military. And all that's been declining. So these areas that used to be very developed and like even used to be mill towns in the 70s and 80s are now like half the city's a husk. It looks like Detroit. Like,
I mean, I'm only vaguely familiar from spending very little time in driving through basically a few times Fayetteville, but yeah, that military kind of military based city is pawn shops and strip clubs, right? Like,
yep. And out west, you have a similar problem that's different, but it's still similar. So out here in like if you're in like the Dakotas or in Wyoming, or if you're in like Utah, but not in the two urban areas, which are interestingly split politically, but you're in extractive capacity, and if you're not in that, there's no infrastructure for you, and like the weather sucks and you can't even do agriculture here. What the hell are you doing here? Like and interestingly about extractive capacity in the United States, it's counter-cyclic to the rest of the economy. So like when shit's down, it's like really good to move to like South Dakota or Wyoming, and when stuff is better, it's, you know, everything is exactly like you're saying. It's strip clubs and liquor stores and gambling. And I think that element of the United States, this is something that like I get really mad at socialists. If you want to deal with labor, you have to speak to that, not just urban labor in New York and California, which is all the DSA really focus on now. I know they say they focus on more, but they don't have structures to deal with it. And this is also why I think you need like your approach to how you deal with racial inequity has to be better than quotas. But my favorite example of this actually is in politics. If you looked at progressive leadership, you would think that it was the most racially diverse category in the country. Like that people who identified as progressives were by far of color and were women. Every single poll stat, and I realize we've already talked about how they're flattening, but I think this does tell you something. The whitest political self-identified category in the country is progressives.
Mm-hmm.
Which means they haven't done a whole, even by making a lot of the leadership of color for reasons, they actually haven't done a lot of the structural things to make themselves appealing to mass people of color, like outside of a class sliver that's going to be pretty small.
Yeah, I mean, I wonder if that's, yeah, I mean, I don't doubt anything you're saying. What I wonder is, like, in some sense, like, I mean, this is the question between what is progressive. This is the question of labor versus progressive, right?
Right.
Like, right, like, what is it that ties one to? Because at the end of the day, like, those allegiances, how strong are they?
I don't know.
Right?
I mean,
like, how powerful is that as like progressivism as a name, right? Like, I mean, how strong is that as a political category?
that's a good question. One thing I can tell you is that the one group, the one area where we see the most we've seen the quickest disenfranchisement with the Democratic Party is in Latin voters, and then after that, in Black men in specific. You want to talk about intersectionality? Let's add some categories together. Why is that? I have no idea. And Latin voters, the indication is like they're not becoming Republicans, they're just becoming more and more conservative Democrats. The reason seems to be that they don't feel, and they hear again, we're flattening a whole lot to even talk this way, and I admit that, because all you have is polls are inherently flattening. That they don't feel like the issues that they care about, immigration and job creation, are going to ever be addressed by progressive Democrats, and so other interests combined. Now, let me talk about like what those other interests are. Recent immigrants to the United States from Latin communities are much more likely to be contractors and small business people, because if you don't speak English well, it's harder to get like the kind of government job we were talking about available to the Black community. And you don't know people to get hired into jobs into the white community generally unless you're well established here. And so what are you going to do? Well, you open up your own business. And the political trajectory of petty bourgeois people tends to be more conservative. So
yeah, no, that's exactly so. But that's kind of, yeah. I mean, that's the kind of question I'm posing. It's kind of like, is that just asking, like, why don't more people of color have politics as a hobby?
Yeah, I mean, exactly. It is kind of asking that, which the obvious question is they have other shit to deal with, right? But the question becomes to me, why is progressivism the one label that is associated the most with politics as a hobby? I mean, the second group that is pretty white is actually the God and Guns people. That's what they called them in the thing. I guess that would be like religious conservatives.
But the guns, not all religious conservatives are gun people. I mean, guns is, I mean, you know, in my analysis, guns is also a hobby, frankly.
Right. So it's like, and my thing is like, you know, there were all these like broad-based socially conservative mass movements, and they were mass, like mega churches and stuff in the aughts, that were really actually innovative in a lot of ways in how they like dealt with women and power dynamics. And this is another thing where I wish we took intersectionality at this more and looked at it, that kind of fell apart at the in the Great Recession at the end of the Bush administration, for reasons that, you know, my Marxist heart goes, well, capitalism dissolves everything, but like my analysis heart goes, yeah, but how does it do it? Like that's actually a bigger question.
Yeah.
That have dissolved, and what that to me led to is actually like, okay, the God and guns people are politically hobbyist. They tend to be quote Trumpist, and interestingly, it's because they don't have a cultural identity any longer separate from their political one. Like the
yeah.
Well, interestingly, in the black church, that's not true. Like it's just not true at all.
I wonder if you were to look at the kind of, I don't know I mean, is there a similar kind of megachurch phenomenon in black churches
No.
in the South?
Ooh, that's actually a tough question.
I mean, because I know of some of these, like,
anecdotally, no. Like, but that's, I don't have studies on that. I don't even know if anyone's actually like studied that. Like,
it's like, I know just anecdotally some of these, like, prosperity gospel types have big followings in the last 15, 20 years, I imagine. But I don't know if that translates into a similar kind of trend out of like neighborhood or smaller functioning churches, right? Because I mean, in some sense, like I really appreciate. I mean, I think I got this from you, that the megachurch is actually a sign of deterioration, right? Of a community, right? Like
right.
that it's like,
it led to this really innovative period. Actually, like I was talking to Erica Rabales Anderson, and she was like I study megachurches when I started studying complexity and social reproduction, because they're actually better at inculcating women. They're better, and they actually are. I think that's true. But my thought was like, they only needed to get that innovative though, because they were already beginning to have problems. Like if they were,
yeah, it's a bigger institution, right? And so
right,
it can't just be the minister and their kind of cadre, right? It has to be a more institution. It has to be more of an actual organization, right? Like,
right,
when you have those small churches, you have the preacher, you have however many preachers, but usually you have one person in charge, right? And it's, you don't have to do anything according, it's kind of one party rule, right? Like,
right.
I mean,
But interestingly, that's possible in like a highly Protestant, scenario, because there's so much cultural capital and everybody's Protestant, so you can pull and have these sustain these smaller organizations. Whereas by the time you get to mega churches, those small churches just can't sustain themselves either. Like they don't have, even if they have the same amount of parishioners or congregants, excuse me, they can't maintain the same infrastructure. Their infrastructure would be collapsing. So I find that was an interesting proof of secularization to me. I think the other proof was like the lack of political diversity in these movements actually indicated that like what was holding them together was not just like the social and moral mission anymore. Whereas, let's say the Catholic Church, it's mostly liberal, although interestingly, it also produces all the conservative legal scholarship tends to be from Catholics, which is weird. But
they value a classical education.
Yes, I think that tells you where this stuff kind of is. But the Catholic Church has always been a mass organization because it's the one church, so it's got to be. This, what I find interesting, if like I would love to look at like not just Christian movements to see how these patterns played out. It's hard. Christian groups are the only groups in the United States that are old enough and big enough that you can see mass trends that are not like highly receptive to like small movements, like if you look at Judaism or Islam, those are what I know. Judaism is weird because Americans think Judaism is a world religion, and I'm like, the most Jews in the world are in the United States. There's even more Jews in the United States than Israel. Second most are in like Europe. They're a tiny religion compared to everybody else.
Even compared to Mormons, I think, right?
Yeah, no, I mean, yeah, like even there are sub demographics of Christians that are much larger than Jews. But Islam's interesting because Islam in the United States and Europe is, I don't know if it's still growing in the United States, but it's growing, but it's actually interesting to compare it to, say, Islam in Europe, because it's almost the opposite trend as far as like social integration and whatever, and that's despite all the bullshit that happened after 9/11 and in the 80s, like you know, which is, you want to talk about complexity again, this is why I oppose stuff like guest worker programs, because I'm like, well, that creates a permanent underclass, and that's how Europe has been handling a whole lot of its problems with profitability when it turns to maintaining labor, just like having a larger and larger permanent unintegratable underclass that does a shit ton of labor. Like and again, so we have to have a complex approach to this. I'd be like, and this is why I said I wish we had a materialist intersectionality, because the materialist intersectionality would basically be, okay, even if you take class as dominant, you may not, I do, we still have to look at all these other factors as co-causal, like in the emergent in a complex interaction in both individuals and groups.
I guess my inclination is, rather than kind of pit the categories, is to take them apart and see, for any particular, like what we're looking at, how is it working, right? Like because I think that like this kind of dive into race and the kind of the theoretical dive into race for me has been useful in understanding that race isn't this static thing. And so it's hard to compare two categories that like have so many different valences, right? Like, and that's, many of them overlap. It's kind of like, it's like, pick a random spot in the ocean and tell me, is that the Gulf of Mexico or is that the Atlantic Ocean? It's like, I don't know. Like,
right, yeah.
Right? Like,
it is a specific spot in the ocean, though.
Right? Yeah. It's like, well, it's like, is that the Gulf Stream or is that the Atlantic Ocean? Right? Like, I don't know. Like, and you could, even though there may be emergent categories, like there might be a particular mode of analysis that is both a race and class, right? As we would think, like the category can't be the starting point, right? In some sense, because you're going into an analysis with predetermined kind of, like with a predetermined concept, right? So it's like,
well, this is interesting, like to just go back into the reason dialectics as opposed to analytic philosophy, and I know it's not something you deal with, but dialectics, both classically and post-Hegelian, concepts emerge.
Yeah.
They emerge through description and interaction and immanent critique. Whereas in analytic philosophy, concepts are axiomatically defined.
I just think you can't do that with, I mean, you're not,
you can't do that with any of these things, right?
Yeah, like, you can't, because they're not, again, these are dynamic processes. The most, the most useful category to understand race that I've come across is as basically like a process social kind, right? That there is a continuity, but it's inherently a processual concept, right? That you have to take into account that it's moving over time and constantly being reproduced, right? And so it's not, there's no essence, right?
Well, to get all standpointy about this, though, a little bit, to validate our more subjective listeners who've listened to the Marxists try to be objective about this for an hour or 2 hours, do you think that is more obvious to us because we are both liminal types? Like you and I both get mistaken for things.
No.
Things other than the race that most people would identify us as.
But I mean, I think that's exactly the utility of standpoint epistemology, like, right? That like that there is always something that everyone has a different perspective, and that has epistemic value, right? like, and so yeah, no, I totally agree with that, right? That like that if I hadn't traveled to Europe and expected to, like kind of fade into the background, instead I was like, very different in different countries, honestly. But like, the how you that the interaction and the interfacing does teach you
Mhm.
something, right? And it does give you like yeah, I mean, but it's also like, I come from a mixed family, so it's like here I can be categorized from white to black to mixed to do you speak Spanish to like go away you Arab, like, you know what I mean? So
Yeah, one of my best friends is a light skinned black woman who, like, even I, when I met her, could not identify her race. I was like, it's
because
just like you are some kind
again,
of brown person, but I don't know what kind. Like,
yeah, I mean, but it says so, it does say something, right? And it's like, you know, it's
it
like trying
also
to,
says something that I can't disaggregate. Like, we are talking about the problems of, like, the way we talk about race, like about, like, the fact that it still has blood quanta weirdness in it. We ourselves also can, no matter how hard and rigorous we try to be, when we go back to everyday language, we replicate a lot of the same problems.
yeah, no,
Like,
exactly. Like, like, well, what you just said, right? Like, I couldn't categorize, quantify, I couldn't figure out her race as if that was something that
that you
could
could
be
just
figured out,
do.
that had an answer, right?
Right, exactly. And it's like it's the liminal case that proves the problem with the rule in the first place, but also um it really does point out to you. I mean, the other example of this is really messes with Americans. I taught at a school that was really interesting, ended up being a scam, but charter school that both served the refugee community for free, but took rich immigrant, uh our rich expatriate or whatever you want to call them. They weren't planning on staying. Rich exchange students for money in a private school within the public school, which was a terrible idea. Don't do it. It should have never been allowed. But it did create this interesting interaction when the Black Lives Matter people, the official organization, not like the protesters, showed up to give a speech in 2018, and they're talking about, they're doing this whole stuff about how great Africa is and all this, and then they start talking about where they did the thing that was a common thing amongst Black Lives Matter activists. It's like, well, it's okay to be proud of your Irish heritage or your German heritage, but it's not okay to be proud of, like, whiteness. Like, that was their talking point at the time. But then they started talking about, like, blackness to a room full of a mixture of Somali, Ethiopian refugees, and then rich people from Mali, Kenya, and
Yeah,
Senegal.
yeah.
You can imagine how fucking confused my students were,
There's a
and how,
lack of what we would call cultural competence going
right,
on there.
it went for, well, the other thing is that my African students were super into it at first. It's like, yeah, I'm sick of being told that basically Africa is this fucking poor ass wasteland, to like, what the fuck you talking about? We're all just black. Like,
Yeah,
it was really funny. I was like, somebody should
yeah.
have warned the speaker, but I don't know, even if you'd have warned her, that she would have had a way to address it in the US framework. Like, it was just like
Yeah, I mean, that's a rough one. I mean, and
that's a
that's just a
tough
hard
one.
one because that is so much of a subjective thing, right? That it's just like the reflexive response is, oh, like it make like, obviously it makes sense to like being proud of being black makes a lot of sense in the context of the United States, right?
Mm.
Like, just as if it, being proud of being whatever ethnicity you come from in, like I don't, you said people from all over Africa. I imagine they identify probably with their own ethnicities, if
They
not
identify their
their
own
their
ethnicities.
nations. like as they come to the country, that kind of gets collapsed into like the nation to others, but probably still their ethnicity amongst their own, like people from their own country, right?
Well, I mean,
and
the
like,
biggest ethnic picture we had, I mean, honestly, was Somalis versus Ethiopians, and that was.
But and it's like Ethiopians, honestly, at this time during a civil war, it's like, what does that mean, right?
Well,
Like,
yeah.
are you
Also,
Amhara? Are you Tigray? Like, are you, like
yeah.
Ethiopian used to actually include Eritreans, right?
I was about to say, and we also have a ton of Eritreans, which is a whole different. And then it's like, okay, are you an Amharic speaker? Are you a Tigray speaker? Are you an Eritrean speaker? And I mean, the American white gaze has no idea how to deal with that. They're like, bleh, bleh.
Maybe this is a good way back in, though, right? Because at least from my experience, it's kind of like in a strange circumstance or in a new context, right? You build up your solidarities with what you got, right? Like if for me, it's like, if I'm rarely going to encounter someone with my specific like racial, ethnic, whatever background. So it's like there's a like what I guess you could say ADOS, or Black Americans. It's like that's my guy. That's my person. That's my like but it's like you kind of build up just shorthand, like who could I talk to, like who do I immediately have some kind of connection if when confronted with that, right? So it's like I guess the question is like, if we're talking about, if the goal is thinking about like building a ways of thinking about these things that create solidarity, it's kind of like, what are the prompts or interventions that might apply that approach, you know what I mean, other than just like kind of your standard like visual cues that are not necessarily going to give you that much, right? I mean, maybe they will, I don't know.
No,
maybe you just
like my other experience about what really broke my American concept of race was living in the Republic of Korea. One,
ask the Korean people living in Japan, like about
right,
right, like how many generations are you still Korean?
Well, the word for Asian in Korean is Asia, which means it's a foreign concept.
The
Minyuk, even that word, which is the Korean blood race word, is actually imported from Japan, ironically, which is misul in Japan. And even that, which I'm probably butchering Japanese speakers, sorry. And even that actually doesn't have a long pedigree. It's actually the word they made up to correspond to the German word for race. So, but is there a concept of a Han or an ethnic group? Absolutely. But even like they had like, and it's been racialized now in Korea and Japan in particular, a little bit in China, but not as bad. But that's all a very late concept. And even amongst, it's actually more like when you're dealing with Europeans and like in the 19th century and you're hearing people talk about like the English race or the Celtic race or the Anglo-Saxon race. Well, for Koreans, it's a Korean race. And then like the next best group of subhumans is white people, not other Asians. So it's but also how different the racial conceptions are. Being pure anything, whatever that means, is better than being mixed race anything.
Interesting.
Like, okay, so there's that. And then there's a hierarchy amongst Koreans, like the Chinese Koreans, the ethnic Koreans who split off into China when like way back in the end of the Choson period. The Choson was kind of split before it got split later on into North and South. There's also another split and what the Korean Autonomous Zone in China, which is still a thing. and you have the Chinese Koreans who are kind of half part of the Minyak, which are like, well, they're Koreans, but they're lesser because they've been around. And the other thing is also like Kyopos, which are Koreans by blood but not by nationality. So like people who like Korean Americans who are like both parents are Koreans, but they didn't grow up in the soil of Korea, therefore they're this other thing. And then I just realized, like, okay, this has been racialized by a context with the West, you know, but this
specifically America too, right?
Yeah, specifically America, yeah,
because that the whiteness, that version of you know, a pure like German, Croatian, Greek, Italian.
Yeah.
You know, like that's a kind of purity that stretches it.
Well, I mean, their encounters with quote white people are going to be in Korea prior to is going to be the Portuguese as traders, the Americans, maybe the British, and the Russians, and that's it. And also, do the Russians count? We don't even know. So
that seems to be in flux.
Like that, yeah. I mean, even now, it's like,
I don't know if you saw, like at the beginning, like probably a year ago, at the beginning of the Ukraine thing, there was a Wall Street Journal, maybe it was a magazine, I'm not sure, but a cover with Putin, and it said, you know, Russia's Asian roots, and it had him dressed up as like a, you know, some kind of Hun, you know. So
yeah, you just see that you see that come again. It's like, oh man, they're even picking up so weird Central European race theory. About like the difference between the Ukrainian Rus and the Muscovy Rus was like how Asian they were or something. Yeah, it's madness. I mean, like I studied anthropology and genetic anthropology, and that's when this like the true madness of this. I'm just, you know, gets real clear just to remove our blood quotient part of the show so people know that I intellectually understand this. The biggest genetic diversity on the planet is quote subcontinent, and even that's a bad category, Africans, because genetically speaking there's a bigger difference between, say, like certain tribes in West Africa with certain like Southeast African tribes than there are between all other phenotypic groups. So like all white Asians, indigenous Americans, etc., are more closely related genetically than certain quote subcontinent African groups are from subcontinent African groups. That's just population genetics. Like, and so when you realize
these
that,
are also very, very small margins, what we're talking about, right?
Oh, tiny. Like, I mean, like, you know, just to remind people, also we share a whole lot of DNA with a banana. So like just you know, just to make the discourse obvious to people. So like we are dealing with big gaps, and even these big gaps are quite small. And then you deal with the fact that like you have convergent evolution with certain groups, like, you know, this whole everybody was doing like when people were doing the skull caliber things, they like thought indigenous aborigines were the same as black people somehow because they like have co-evolved similar traits to certain kinds of traits associated with blackness. And there's no genetic link whatsoever. Like, well, yeah, I mean, other than everybody's from Africa, but like that's how far back you got to go. Like, so yeah, I mean, scientifically, it's all bullshit. But and interestingly, like that's the one thing anthropologically we can say for certain is even genetic differences that you find between groups do not correspond to racial differences particularly strongly at all. So
yeah, so you know, I guess
I guess we just have been making this more and more complex as we talk.
No, but you know, I think I'm trying to like think through what are some of the key, because you know, I mean, your labor experience is also it's very useful, right? Because it's like people do want to understand or think through a lot of these things. I think there's a lot of, this is why this whole DEI industry is so big. But like, the concern that I think that we both share is that, are we actually getting at some of these things, or are we just enforcing kind of a legal framework or a reified kind of racial concept versus building an understanding that has the capacity to create like a practical solidarity, right?
Yeah, I feel like one of the ironies of intersectional theory is that I do feel like, for all of critical race theory's understanding of a lot of the problems that we're talking about, the moment it tries to move it back into policy and common language, it actually ends up reifying a lot of the same categories.
Well, because I think in some sense, what are the institutional mechanisms that it's hanging its hat on, right? Like, if it's the courts, if it's like basically just existing like social power, then it's like, okay, I mean, this is Derick Bell's tragedy all over again, right? That it's like the kind of functional legal approach that if you integrate it, it will come, is not, that it's not particularly hopeful at this moment, right?
It's not really hopeful. We don't have a lot of evidence for it, and
yeah. And so,
I mean, and then we have to add another intersectional factor, and is U.S. partisanship, like, which is,
well, I mean, the great destroyer of. But again, how powerful is that? I mean, I think that it is, like, it's kind of what we said before. Like, maybe to the political hobbyist, that's incredibly powerful, but like, I mean, is that everybody? I mean, to me, that's like it's like the argument you've got, or like the motivating force that you've got when you got nothing else, right? Because it's just given to you. It's spoon fed from the TV news, right? Like,
I mean, this is the irony that I have pointed out to a lot of people, is like, the moment that we have the strongest partisan identification is actually the moment where even the parties are substantively weak as social forces. And people don't get that, but like, everyone cares about politics right now, and it's like, it's because they don't have any influence on local politics at all. And so partisan politics is just something you can adopt based off largely regional, racial, and religious prior coding, but it substitutes for all of them, right? Like, but it's also real thin. Like, it's real. Like, what does it mean to be a Republican now? Like, okay, is it the way you're an asshole on Twitter and Facebook? Like, is that what that means? Like, and I'm not sure. And again, another intersectional factor we haven't talked about, except you mentioned time, and time's something that socialists in particular don't like dealing with, but I think generational politics do end up mattering. I think we overemphasize them in dumb ways in America, but like, starting with the baby boomers forward. And although, again, even with the baby boomers, the reason why we did that was material. There was a fucking lot of them. It literally changed the entire infrastructure of the country. But after that,
they were also born at a particular time that was
right.
that was completely, like, I mean, the generation after the most significant event of the century that reformed the material base of the core of capitalism.
Right. Well, I mean, basically, the core of capitalism moved, and this is unique.
Expanded.
This is even, expanded, and also, you had one country that had most of the world's wealth, and it didn't even have to take it.
Yeah.
Like, that's the thing that people like don't understand. I'm like, oh yeah, there's all the empire building and accumulation in the United States in the 19th century, but that's not what caused the 50s to happen. It was sheer fucking dumb luck. Like,
dumb luck and like
geography.
Geography is a huge part of it, right? And just like, every bomb that was built increased U.S. industrial capacity while destroying the like in the other main competitor countries, right? Well, and we took no hits.
I was gonna say it's the last part. Like the other places were doing that, but they took hits. We didn't.
Yeah.
So we built up the industrial capacity, and we were like, "Hey, we have this industrial capacity. We'll even empower our former enemies as long as they're not in Latin America, because fuck that shit."
Yeah. Well, because we need some stuff, but also like that, just like you're talking about on your program, the Belt and Road as partially a vent for industrial capacity or for infrastructural capacity, right? Like we rebuilt, mostly Germany, Europe, and Japan, but also built the hell out of this country in all forms of infrastructure that have since been deteriorating for the last 40 years, right? So
we also built the world's trade infrastructure, or we either subsumed it from the British, which is a lot of it, but we also built a shit ton of it.
Yeah. So again, people born at the height of that, or as that expanded, how could you not think that has massive implications for, but one, their objective reality, but also for their subjective experience of the world, and their subjective experience, especially in relation to government, especially in relation to, as opposed to people born in the last 30 years whose experiences decline, right? And like physical and political, and in just a total mirror image, right? So it's
30
like,
years,
okay,
I mean, okay, I would say, well, the 90s makes this a little complicated, but I would say if you actually look at the longue durée of things, it's everybody born after the baby boomers. So even the Gen Xers, like they never reach baby boomer heights of wealth ever. Millennials,
but it's not clear. It's not unambiguously clear that it's like that. That it's a totally decline is not on the tip of the tongue.
No. I mean, it seems like for the Gen Xers that grow up under the thing that's a fluke, and there is a brief time period in the 1990s where it looks to be not true.
Yeah.
Right. That's very brief. It's actually, to my mind, actually based off you're still actually on fumes from the 40s and 50s, but it's there, and particularly after the Soviet Union falls apart, there looks like there's going to be another chance of this massive expansion. It just doesn't happen that way. But yeah, if you're born, if you're not at least our age, I mean, you've only known decline. Like,
I mean, you're a teacher, so I'm sure you experience this daily. I was just talking to someone who's teaching undergraduates, and say, that kind of teaching it's something like I'm not exactly sure what the course is, but it's very multidisciplinary, kind of like a PPE-ish course. But he's teaching Marx, he's teaching Ricardo, he's teaching Smith, like primary source based course. But he says, the kids come in are just like doom. It's like he has to say, a big part of the challenge is like showing them that like the end of the world was happening in many earlier times as well. And that, people thought their way through it.
What I think this is interesting too, and maybe this will be our next discussion when we talk about complexity of culture, right? We talk about complexity of intersectionality, which was we really should. I'm going to still labor it complexity of intersectionality. It's really complexity of race, with through an intersectional framework, because we really haven't touched on gender that much.
Yeah, I think we should. We can try to. I would like to summarize a little bit to try to.
Let's summarize here. I was about to say build up to this, because I want to talk. I do want to think about what a fascinating trend in American culture is. It's like religiously apocalyptic post baby boom, and then like post 2000s, it's materially apocalyptic. It's no longer just a spiritual apocalypticism that we kind of grew up. Like baby boomers were like inundated in that shit. But like
all those Zoomers 70s cults and everything.
Zoomers are like, they're not. This is not a spiritual apocalypticism. This is like a well, most shit's gonna die. Like there is no future, blah 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 blah. Or if there's a future, it's in like China or some shit. And, and I both like I want to push back on them for the same reason that you're talking about. I'm like, yeah, this collapse has been happening for other people all the time for like 200 to 300 years. But when we get to the complexity of culture, because it's so subjective and there's so many different parts, that's the hardest part to speak about. That's why Marxists, part of the reason why I think Marxists just avoid it.
Well, I mean, the other thing is, I think, I mean, to give the Zoomers their due, I don't think there's been a period in human history of total, well, like global material collapse, right? Like,
well, I mean, that's what Joseph Taylor predicted in the 70s. Is like, it's like we see these things happen all over the world. We've never had a global integrated political economic culture before. Now,
but we've also never been, yeah, exactly, right. But also with this like meta problem of climate change, right? That makes that forces a kind of a global perspective that is like not that's kind of outside the scope
of other serious climate change with human beings have been in times where we would not have understood it.
Exactly, right. That it's, yeah, exactly.
And it also wouldn't have been our fault. But like we have lived through theoretically as massive climate changes before, but we didn't know what was going on. Like,
yeah, I mean, I'm not one of those people that buys into the like humanity, everything's going to be extinct. Like, I mean, I'm sure there's some climate model out there that says the planet becomes completely desertified. But I mean, I'm disinclined to believe that, but I don't know.
Me too, and I actually think the inclination to believe that is politically disastrous about doing anything about it.
Yeah.
But that's a different conversation.
That's a different topic. But yeah,
so summarize and then we'll pivot where we're going to go on the next episode.
So the things that I'm going to throw out some of the things that have emerged for me as useful, and because I want to keep thinking about this in terms of, and ideally put it into practice in a way that like could be useful. So like, one of the things is really kind of, drawing, like being very clear, because I want to be a generous interpreter of people's views, right? And like really being explicit about, especially when talking about race, because it can be a very difficult thing to talk about, right? That be very explicit about we can look at things subjectively and objectively, right? And like that all these kind of material objective factors that we talked about don't necessarily are not arguments against subjective experience, right? Like you can't talk people out of subjective experience. You can give them tools to better interrogate it, right? And I think often a material analysis that brings in terms like, instead of privilege, some of the concepts you discuss, like, social capital, but even, history, geographical, spatial, cultural history, right, are ways of that are a tool set that people can use to actually interrogate their subjective experience, right? But like I think that part of what makes a lot of these conversations so fraught is that they're interpreted as saying these objective factors are arguments against the validity of your subjective experience.
Right. Which I think that so what we can deduce from that as positively political practices is like, unless you have reason not to, trust that people are being honest about their subjective experience, and know your inclination that all subjective experience is bullshit is not reason not to. So that's number one. Like, meeting people where they are means also, like, in some ways, validating that their subjective experience, even if their objective description of what is causing it may be wrong, that the experience itself is real and has to be accounted for.
Because
Right.
yeah, exactly. Like, because I mean, and this is like, I mean, this is a big part of my kind of even philosophical perspective, right? Our like, if your goal is to impose a vocabulary on someone's understanding, that is authority, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, if your goal is to create a shared vocabulary, that is much more like community, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so if we're clear that those are two ways that we can operate, we can choose, right? And I think that when you get like in some ways, it's the difference between organizing a cult and organizing solidarity, right?
Mm.
And those things aren't always clear. But organizing a cult is owning truth and imposing it, right? Organizing solidarity is developing shared vocabulary, right? And that starts with what you're saying. You meet people where they are. You understand. You understand things how they understand, and you share how you understand. And so then you can come to a point where we're talking about the same thing, right?
Mm-hmm. Hmm. So that's one.
I mean, does that make sense? Or what?
Yeah, it makes sense.
You're, okay, you're looking a little skeptical.
No, I am. I am. So this is a larger philosophical problem, but I have two. My brain is split between two thoughts about like the social emergence of language and the need to build a common language on one hand, and then the need for conceptual and intellectual clarity on the other.
Mm-hmm.
And just like between common language and rigorous analytic language, you need different things. Those are kind of not entirely related.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm thinking about when you talk about this, like, how do you bridge that gap? How do we say, like, okay, we have these analytic frameworks, they're in certain words, we understand them through these words, but we do have to build another way to approach this. It like valorizes a lot of these a lot of these experiences and stuff that are not dealt with in the concept, in this rigorous analytic framework. But unlike a lot of my subjectivist anarchisty friends, not drop the analytic framework altogether once you start building that common vocabulary.
Because
And
even that's what we're saying with what's happened to the concept of intersectionality in this
right.
conversation, right? That it isn't generally deployed, and it's often used in that kind of authoritative sense, as if I'm holding truth, and that's when you get alienation, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I'm the answer. I mean, that's a long way of saying that is a hard thing to reconcile and requires constant practice and trial and error and implementation and failure, right? Like,
right. I think the other thing and this is my finger wagging at our Artusarian friends, just because something is not in your structural analytic does not mean it's not real. And not this is not just this is a specific subcategory type of Marxist that wants to be like, well, there's the ideological superstructure and this is all, and then there's like the repressive state apparatus, and then there's like, I guess, the base of the economy, and then and I'm like, yeah, no, you can't actually incorporate everything that we're talking about into those kinds of schema. You can't. Which is why I'm still a small m, no hyphen, small h Marxist humanist. But and it's about these kinds of issues because I want to be honest with the fact that I think even if we took care of capitalism and built to socialism, because of the nature of human sociality and also the persistence of alienation, some of these things are still something we have to deal with in a post-communist, and by post-communist I mean we actually won. I don't mean like we moved beyond the ideology of communism. Society, like there'll be civil conflicts, not just political ones, but they're still gonna be there. And how do you have the framework for dealing with them? The Marxist traditional framework is also flattening, and it's like nation building as your administrative unit. Like, and what we mean by nations is like linguistic groups with a shared history and maybe a shared religious context that we're also trying to transcend. And this has been a cul-de-sac for them. Like, really has been. You want to talk about like where Marxists get to the most fights because there's no clear guidance theoretically. Well, you know, like we're pro national liberation, but also we're pro internationalism, but also we're anti nationalism, acceptance of like you know, it gets into this like weird bizarro land, and race is that writ both larger and smaller, and so we have to be really flexible in the way we deal with a lot of this stuff, or you're going to automatically alienate people. And I also think the other things we can say is like we do have to distance ourselves from certain dominant liberal discourses. I think the other thing, privileged discourse is not because it's wrong, it's because it flattens so many different things together in a way that's unclear. It actually is less clear, like no, not more so.
And I think it sneaks and that's the other thing.
And it sneaks meritocracy back in.
It sneaks meritocracy in it. And I think the other thing that it sneaks in that I find toxic is not, maybe toxic is the wrong word. It has too many implications, but like it sneaks, to me, it encourages white guilt, which is
fucking
like
useless.
A destroyer of organization.
Yeah.
Right. Because it motivates people completely solipsistically, right? It motivates people internally, not in relation to others. Mm-hmm. Right. And like that is not solidarity. That is like that's assuasion. That's you know, it's buying indulgences, right? And I think that is really not, you know, because it encourages people to think that they have privilege that needs to be purged, you know?
Yeah.
As opposed to like potential for power with others.
Like, yeah, I mean, like it's like those white women who almost white women who pay to like serve black people as some kind of weird you know, like experience of whatever. That shit's wild to me.
Yeah, I mean, you know, the problem, you know,
I mean, it's also not common, but it does like, but I don't want to say like one of these like people who think that like rich white people at HR trainings run by Robin DiAngelo are actually a common experience to even most white people, even who are in like white collar jobs, because I've never sat through one of those.
Yeah, no, you know, because it's like unacknowledged privilege is like, you know, if we're going to use that language, it's like it can be gross, it can be uncouth, it can be annoying, it can be alienating. You know, you know, if someone is acting as if they are your equal or they share your experience, and it's very clear that they've been given 35 legs up where you've been kicked down, right? It's a little bit, it can be humiliating, right? And but that's what's important, right? Like what's important is that you're the person with privilege, you're not bad for having these things. You're like anti-solidaristic for not being aware, for not being self-aware enough to know that you're not, that everyone has different experiences, right? And so, but the point is for not for you to be like, I'm, you know, look at me, I'm good now. It's like to be like, no, like use what you have to build something. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I'm definitely with you on the building projects. And I guess the one thing I would say as my close away is if we're going to use anything like a post-intersectional framework to deal with complexity and the complexity of the way people experience the world and encounter that, it does have to have a solidaristic goal, like as its orientation for why you're doing it.
Or
and
an honest one at least.
or admit what you're actually trying to do, right? Like like uh like for example, like I don't have any problem with critical legal theory because like it does what it does in the context of the law. I've never been under the delusions that anyone was going to ever use the law as a revolutionary force. I'm not an idiot. Like, so yes, will there have to be revolutionary legal conceptions? Absolutely, but that's not like on the best case scenario. Critical legal framework is a way to build a more effective defensive legal capacity, and that's it. That's it. That's all anyone should ever expect from
look,
it.
unless you really, I mean, unless you're willing to tell Derick Bell he's wrong, right?
I mean, I'm willing to tell a lot of people they're wrong, but
No, I'm just saying in terms of his in terms of in terms of his lack of faith in existing institutional structures.
Oh well, yeah,
In
no,
the law, right?
This is
That's what I mean.
To me, this is where Derick Bell is the most correct.
Yeah. No, I mean, you can tell anyone they're wrong. I'm just saying, like, if you're gonna if you think that status quo liberal normative legal frameworks are capable, then
good luck
sure.
with that. The funny thing is, like, I don't even think status quo liberals believe that anymore.
Yeah.
Yeah. So as some key takeaways for a very complex topic that we're gonna probably have to circle back around to over time. I think I'm going to label this one Vulgar Complexity 3: The Complexity of Intersectionality, a parentheses race. I think we do kind of talk about the other intersectionality framework that is super dominant on people's minds. That's gender and social reproduction. Mm-hmm. And I will tell you, this more than race is the one that I am always hesitant to do because I'm super careful about how I speak about it because of the number of fracture lines there is currently. Mm-hmm. But and I don't want to throw anybody. And the reason why I'm careful is not because I'm afraid. It's because I don't want to throw anyone under the bus. But so we need to talk about that. And I think this is one of these areas where like neither one of us have a whole lot of experience on being a woman and any of the definitions that could possibly have. But you do have experience with children. So it's and I work in a mostly female workforce. Uh-huh. And so that's going to be our subjective insight to this, but know that we are more full of shit on this one than normal. I might try to ask some of my female audience if they might want to be in on this one. I'm not sure yet, but we'll get on it. At least in the race one, it wasn't two white guys talking the entire time. So we'll see. But I think we have to deal with that. And then maybe I do want to talk about what's happened to, quote, working class, unquote, culture. And maybe have a more complex view of that than just like, oh, it's epiphenomenal to capital entirely. Because I'm actually increasingly not convinced of that. That like I'm not convinced you can separate politics, culture, and economics that cleanly. I'm just not. And leftists want to like separate culture out and make it epiphenomenal, and then conservatives want to the opposite. They want to say everything else is epiphenomenal but culture. So and then they don't want to define what culture is either. So I guess that's episodes Vulgar Complexity 4 and 5 laid out for us.
Oh boy.
Which also means that we can search for readings and topics. So see you in a month or so, and have a great day.